they went from this
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf.
to this.
What about side by side with a friend?
I could do that.
Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword, your YouTube home for The Lord of the Rings and all things J.R.R. Tolkien. In today's video, we look just why the relationship of Legolas and Gimli is so important.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
First things first, everyone, do not forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more future Tolkien greatness. Approximately 6,700 years before the events recounted in The Lord of the Rings, another jewelry-infused case of madness was making its rounds in Middle-earth. We are talking about the Silmarils, of course. As you might notice from the name, the Silmarillion is itself an account of the various and many conflicts that were caused in whole or in part by the lust of ownership for the Silmarils created by the legendary smith Fëanor. You can imagine it as a precursor to the way the Ring of Power corrupts people in the Third Age, though the Silmarils were not inherently evil or even wicked by design. Those who would seek to possess and claim the light of the Silmarils for their own would kick off not one, not two, but 3 kin slayings. The sack of cities and the madness of war, blood feud and hatred between the Sylvan elves and the dwarves would all come from this. This ancient distrust was still alive and well in the time of the War of the Ring, and we will look at the origins for this hatred between these races and how the friendship of Gimli and Legolas was able to bridge this ancient divide and lead their people into a better future at the culmination of the War of the Ring. First of all, we do have a dedicated video in looking at the origins of why the dwarves and the elves hate each other, so if you'd like to look at that in more depth, I will put the link in the description below, but let us have a quicker overview for you all here, just in case. To say that the elves and dwarves broadly hated each other might miss the mark, as the disdain between these people was primarily between the dwarves and the Sindar elves, being the elves of Telerin descent who lived in Beleriand. To understand why this hate would persist for so long, we have to go back to its origins, or maybe even further than some people may think. It is possible that there was some disdain between the two peoples even further back, to that time of their creation. To be brief, the dwarves were not created by Eru Ilúvatar, but instead by Aule the Smith, one of the Valar, and they were created before the awakening of the elves at Cuivianen, but not allowed to awaken prior to the Eldar, or in other words the elves, or the Secondborn, in other words the men. This makes the dwarves, in essence, the stepchild of Eru, though Ilúvatar would adopt them as his own and breathe life into them before Aule could destroy his creation. I'm not saying that because they were not creations of Eru's thoughts, they would always fight with his true child, but it could well have started them off with some underlying distrust for one another, even if they did not understand why this was. First crafted as a necklace for Finrod, whom the dwarves named Felagund, the Nauglamír would become a piece of jewelry which would bring death and despair in its wake. High King of the Sindar Thingol, father of Luthien and husband of Melian the Maya, asked the dwarves of Nógrod to set the Silmaril into the necklace, which, though heavy with gems, sat lightly upon the neck. After setting the Silmaril into the necklace, the dwarves became hot with pride over their accomplishment and refused to return it to Thingol, claiming it had been forged for a different elf who was now dead. Thingol insulted the dwarves, apparently in such a way that they were overcome with wrath and slew him. They fled with the Nauglamír, though the party was soon overtaken and the necklace reclaimed. However, 2 of their company managed to escape to Nógrod and Belegost and wove a particularly despicable tale about the events. This version of the tale greatly enraged the dwarven race, as in their telling of the events, Thingol had ordered them to be slain. Then great was the wrath and lamentation of the dwarves of Nógrod for the death of their kin and their great craftsman, and they tore their beards and wailed, and long they sat taking thought of vengeance. It is told that they asked aid from Belegost, but it was denied them, and the dwarves of Belegost sought to dissuade them from their purpose. But their counsel was unavailing, and ere long a great host came forth from Novigrad, and crossing over Gelion marched westward through Beleriand. The prior defense of the city that had been the Girdle of Melian, and this was a fence of enchantment set upon the borders of Doriath that prevented anyone to enter against the will of the king, was now lifted upon Melian's departure, which took place not long after King Thingol was slain. Melian sat long in silence beside Thingol the king, and her thought passed back into the starlit years into their first meeting among the nightingales of Nan Elmoth in ages past, and she knew that her parting from Thingol was the forerunner of a greater parting, and that the doom of Doriath was drawing nigh. For Melian was of the divine race of the Valar, and she was a Maya of great power and wisdom, but for her love of Alwë Singolo, she took upon herself the form of the Eldar children of Ilúvatar, and in that union she became bound by the chain and trammels of the flesh of Arda. In that form she bore him Luthien Tinuviel, and in that form she gained a power over the substance of Arda, and by the girdle of Melian was Doriath defended through long ages from the evils without. But now Thingol lay dead, and his spirit had passed to the halls of Mandos, and with his death a change came also upon Melian. Thus it came to pass that her power was withdrawn in that time from the forests of Naldoreth and Region, and Escalduin the enchanted river spoke with a different voice, and Doriath lay open to its enemies. Without the protection of the Girdle of Melian, the dwarves of Novigrad were able to come into Doriath and attack at Menegroth, an intricate system of caves. In the aftermath, this would become known as the Battle of the Thousand Caves. Heavy losses were taken by each side, but the dwarves of Novigrad would be successful, sacking Menegroth, and in doing so, they would Scarpa, now in possession of the Nauglamír, and, in turn, a Silmaril. Word of the sack of Doriath spread across Beleriand, and really angered up the blood of all the elves who heard the foul retelling of how Mablung of the Heavy Hand was killed, being the chief captain of Thingol, and how Menegroth was destroyed, and how the property of the king had been plundered. When word of this came to Beren, the late King Thingol's son-in-law, and of the famous Beren and Luthien tale, he arranged an army of Ents and Lyquendi, the Green Elves of Osiriand, to come together. They were slain nearly to a man, though, at the Battle of Sarn Athrat. Beren killed the Lord of Novigrad himself, retrieved the Silmaril which he had once taken from the Iron Crown of Morgoth, and the remainder of the dwarves were taken unawares in the mountains and slain by the Ents. This is not the end of the sordid tale of the Nauglamír, though, and we will take up the rest of the story in an upcoming video in the childhood of Elrond and his brother Alros too. This is meant to give some insight into the kind of events which are likely to sow the seed for historical hatred, and from this brief overview, it is not hard to understand how this enmity could be long-lasting and not easily put aside. For example, as the son of the Elven king not named in The Hobbit but later retconned as Thranduil, held Gimli's father captive in that quest of Erebor. So this is where we now come to the times of Legolas and Gimli. An important item to remember here is that the elves and dwarves nearly found themselves crossing swords just 60 years prior to the events depicted in The Lord of the Rings during this quest of Erebor, which culminated of course in the Battle of the Five Armies. What might have been an occasion that rekindled this ancient hatred was one instead where they fought against the Bats of the North, wargs, goblins and orcs, all on the same side, as comrades in arms. It is important that Gimli was the son of Gloin, as he is personally present at the Lonely Mountain and the start of the rebuilding of this ancient rivalry that was not finished in his lifetime, but in the lifetime of his son, Gimli. It must be said that Gimli and Legolas were not instant friends, and they would keep each other at arm's length until after their meeting with Galadriel. Yet it is possible that they had begun to warm to each other before the fall of Gandalf at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Legolas has to drag Gimli away from Balin's tomb, and it is hard to read this in any other way than to think that Legolas recognizes that Gimli is in extreme duress and is responding in a naturally humane way to this. This chapter is a personal favourite, and the long passage in the darkness of Moria is a masterclass in writing. The pinpricks of light that Frodo continues to see in the distance, a hint at Gollum's pursuit of the ring through the darkness of the Dead City, Not only is it here that the story truly kicks into second gear, but the immersion of the world becomes oppressive. The darkness and the stale air permeates the words on the page. But for our purposes, this moment takes place in the Chamber of Mizarble, where we first see Legolas showing concern for Gimli, as Gandalf recounts the fate of Balin's folk and their attempt to retake Moria in the aftermath of the events recounted in The Hobbit. What is interesting about this moment is how it leads to Gimli and his father Gloin being sent to Rivendell, where they would encounter the members of the Fellowship prior to its founding. Frodo met Gloin and asked about the fate of Oin and their people, and he had to admit, he did not know. But then if we move on to the time after the events at Amon Hen, looking at the races of Middle-earth as embodied in the three hunters as they become, we get to see the best of their respective peoples as demonstrated in the persons of Aragorn, representing the Secondborn, Legolas, representing the Firstborn, the Elves, and Gimli, representing, respectfully, the stepchildren of Eru. Their interaction and growing friendships throughout the War of the Ring can be looked on as a microcosm of the three groups, and how they are able to put their differences aside to act in the interest of the free peoples of Middle-earth, demonstrating the quality of their character, and that is a quality not racially driven, but just by the individual. It is important to note that the antagonizing comments made by Gimli at the Council of Elrond in the films are not present in the books. Then in the Unfinished Tales we learn that Galadriel travelled through Khazad-dûm en route to Lorien in earlier years, and in another of the many disconnected strands of Celeborn's story, he refused to go with Galadriel because of his anger due to the sack of Doriath. This really shows that it is not just simple black and white between the races. In the chapter of the Mirror of Galadriel, Celeborn is quickly to lay the blame for rousing Durin's Bane at the feet of Gimli's people. It is at this moment that Galadriel says, "Do not repent of your welcome to the dwarf. If our folk have been exiled long and far from Lothlorien, who of the Galadrim, even Celeborn the Wise, would pass nigh and would not wish to look upon their ancient home, though it had become an abode of dragons? Dark is the water of Kheled-Zaram, and cold are the springs of Kibil-Nala, and fair were the many-pillared halls of Khazad-dûm in elder days before the fall of mighty kings beneath the stone." She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. Having to travel through the hidden realm blindfolded, just as Gimli is blindfolded, may have given Legolas some insight, if only ironically, as to how Gimli is as much to blame for the action of his kindred as Legolas is for the actions of his own. The kindness of Lady Galadriel surprises Legolas here. Gimli's request and Galadriel's consent to give him not just a single strand of her fine hair, but 3, mirrors the 3 times Feanor asked for Galadriel's hair himself. That being the same Feanor, of course, that we mentioned earlier, having been the one to craft the Silmarils. Thrice he had asked, and thrice Feanor was denied. But Gimli asked only once, and received 3 in response. It is thought that the relationship between the persons of Gimli and Legolas began to mend from this point forward, with Galadriel's strong rebuke of her husband for his assumption, for him blaming Gimli for the actions of his kin. Surely Legolas would have recognised the wisdom of her words. Who can gain for being blamed for the actions of their kin, either long dead or in recent memory? The illogical remarks of Celeborn are likely to have been put on display here, and allowed for Legolas, going forward, to appreciate Gimli for his own merits, and not to judge him for the action or inaction of his people as a whole. This is when their friendship began to take place, but obviously to fight at someone's side and suffer through the horrors of war with a friend is likely to bring them even closer together.
What about side by side with a friend?
I could do that.
Both Gimli and Legolas represented their people at the Council of Elrond, both being princes and members of ancient and noble families. At the culmination of the War of the Ring, when Aragorn is crowned the king of a reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, Gimli travels back to Aglarond, the glittering caves found behind Helm's Deep, where he and Legolas continue to be friends long after the war. Gimli becomes the Lord of the Glittering Caves, and Legolas, already a Prince of Mirkwood, had a lot in common, and their fate marked the first of its kind in recorded history. That is, Gimli would take no wife and have no children, and in the end, he and Legolas would take a ship into the west, the first and only known dwarf to ever pass beyond the circles of the world. A truly remarkable moment, and one that should never be forgotten. So there we have it. This relationship is huge in its significance. It is not a stretch to say that their friendship was a precursor for each of their people going forward, making what had hitherto seemed unlikely and impossible seem much less so, and the many moments of their camaraderie throughout the war gives us moments of levity in times that would otherwise seem bleak and harrowing beyond endurance. Recall their competition to slay as many orcs as possible, a morbid but friendly contest between these brothers in arms, whose example would make significant strides in improving relations between their peoples, estranged for thousands of years prior to their chance meeting at the Council of Elrond, as though they were brought there by the very hand of Eru himself, there to demonstrate how true friendship is never minor, always meaningful, and never ending. These two passed beyond the circles of the world, but their example was pure, and it would long endure. A pure and simple kindness is never simple, and has profound effects in Tolkien's world. The bloodbath at the 1,000 caves of Menegroth in times gone by was transformed, and so, where the bloodshed that began at Menegroth, it was finally healed by the bond of Legolas and Gimli. With that now though, it is time for my question of the day, which is, has there ever been a better bromance than that of Legolas and Gimli? Are there any that even come close? Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this in the comment section below. And now to shout out our patrons. You guys have been incredible in supporting our short film, and we cannot thank you enough. We have the Divine Power tier members of Kevin and Abram, the Fire Demon tier members of Nishith and Gregory, and the Wizard Staff tier members of John, Andrew, Jennifer, Hunter, and David too. Every single one of you is a true legend of the Brohirrim. Finally, if you have managed to reach the end of the video with me today and you are enjoying what you see on the channel, please hit that subscribe button with the bell icon too, so that you can be notified of all future uploads. And so, thank you for spending just some of your time with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.